Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Sermon Preparation Workshop from St Martin in the Fields. I'm here with Sam Wells. Hi, Sam.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Very well. I hope you're well too.
I am. We've had a bumper weekend at St Martin's, and I've had a nice day of recovery today, which feels good. But it does make me think of a sort of starter question for us today, because we had the wonderful Bishop of Washington preaching on Sunday, a visiting preacher, and I think we maybe talked a bit in the past about how you might approach preaching as a visitor. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about how, as a church, you welcome a visiting preacher. Are there any things that perhaps if we've got someone coming into the church, is there things that you say to them beforehand to help prepare them, or other things that you feel we can do to make people feel confident and safe to preach in your patch, as it were?
Yeah, I think this is not one of my strong areas. If I have any strong areas, this isn't one of them. I'm not very good at briefing people. I'm not always very good at stepping into somebody else's shoes and working out what one doesn't know. I tend to just say, off you go, do your best, and we'll pick the bones out of it. But also I think I still remember my first parish where my incumbent and I always used to we had one, I might have mentioned this before, one 15-year-old young woman who we were worried had started going to the Baptists or not going at all about the time that I arrived. And pretty much she was the litmus test of everything. So we said, would it work for her? And of course she was never there. And I tend to think whenever you say to somebody, well, you need to bear in mind that somebody's just lost a close relative and be very sensitive about it. Of course, they're not there.
Yeah.
Now, of course, that's less of a big deal than it used to be, because they can watch later on a live stream or something like that and still reserve the right to be offended, because we all have the right to be offended and we exercise it at will. So that's not as much a fact as it used to be, but it's just a way of saying you can't really, you have to trust the Holy Spirit on these things. You can't really be focusing your thoughts towards one person or anxious about one person. And, the chances are if that person is there, they'll say, actually, I quite liked it that you referred to that, because I thought you might avoid it because of what happened to me, but I'm quite glad you said it. So,
Yeah.
And then 15 other people say, I'm terribly worried you said that, because she'd be probably terribly offended.
Yeah.
He's already told you she liked it.
So don't be.
This is life.
Overplan those things.
Exactly.
No. Okay. Well, we loved having Bishop Marianne with us, and I think she did a wonderful job of preaching. So we're very grateful for that. If you haven't seen it, do have a look back at the live stream of course, you have your right to be offended.
Of course, she broke the cardinal rule of visiting preachers, as they're supposed to make the regulars look good.
Right. That's the number one rule.
Abject failure.
As always, folks, wherever you're joining us, whether you are on YouTube or on Facebook today, we can see your comments as they come through. So do feel free to say hello, write us a question, pick up on anything we say, and we can make this a workshop in the truest sense. So hello already to Katya, Naomi, and Ruth. It's good to be with you. We're going to have a look at the readings today for 15th Sunday after Trinity. And that means we are beginning with the prophet Jeremiah. Sam, do you have initial?
Yeah, I mean, this is a terrific reading to preach on, because the secret's all in. It's a bit mysterious for someone who's not familiar with the story until you get to the last verse. And basically what this is saying, I mean, you've got some background stuff you probably don't need to go into in a sermon, which is similar to the book of Ruth. There's some kind of obligation on a relative to buy a piece of land in some circumstances. So, let's not worry about that. That's a bit too technical to be worth going into. The really interesting part is the country is in complete crisis. It's about to be invaded and destroyed. And Jeremiah thinks this is a clever time to go and buy a field.
Yeah.
So that is, an unbelievable thing to do. And of course, it's a prophetic statement that well, as it says, in the final verse of the passage, houses and fields and vineyards shall again be bought in this land. And I think this is a good example of a text that bears repetition. If you want to do a sort of a sermon with a refrain, with the rhetoric of a refrain, then, and if what you're giving is, which I suspect you would be giving, is an encouraging sermon that is telling people that things are pretty rubbish now, but God has better things in store. Very much like that passage from Joel, I will restore to you I will restore to you what the locust has eaten. I preached that on that passage at the end of COVID, or what I thought was the end of COVID in July, at the end of lockdown, at the end of July 2020. I will restore to you. Oh no, I didn't. That was I think it was in October 2020, I think. Anyway, sometime during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I think there's two kinds of context in which I think you can preach this sermon. One is if you give some historical examples. I remember preaching a sermon at Duke Chapel in probably 2008, I would guess. You have to sort of calculate the lectionary and when the 3-year cycle comes round. Anyway, round about then, possibly a year or two before or after. And I was talking about how Duke Chapel was built between 1930 and 1934 in the very heat of the Depression, and was an unbelievable thing to do.
Yeah, the confidence.
Because the very nature of a depression like that is you don't know it's going to come to an end. It's the worst depression America's ever seen. Everybody's out of work, and then you go and build, basically the biggest church building in the state. That's a big deal. That's a huge statement of faith. So that's like buying a field. And, I would like to think in a humble way that some of the investment, the proactive investment we made in things like live streaming equipment, curiously, during the pandemic at St. Martin's were a similar kind of buying a field.
Yeah.
So I think sorry?
We wouldn't be here now doing this, would we?
Exactly. So I think there is obviously you don't want to preach self-congratulatory sermons, but I mean, that would be a thing to say at an annual meeting or something.
Yeah.
But so that's one. I think that's one way of preaching on this, and the other is to say it's pretty rubbish right now. What are the ways we can buy a field today? So I think you can do maybe a mixture of those, but either can be powerful. I think probably trying to do both might be too much for most sermons.
Sure.
But I think you can go in either of those directions. I think it can be a very inspiring sermon, and it's a great sermon to preach if things are pretty rubbish right now, because they couldn't be much more rubbish than they were for Jeremiah when this story took place.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading it, the image that, not that I know anyone's done it, I don't know, but the image that was in my head was just this sort of vision of a Ukrainian living in occupied territory at the moment, imagining having the confidence, like, I'm going to set up a business here, or I'm going to, this is where I imagine my future.
On the front line, and I'm going to buy a property and I'm going to start renovating it. Yeah, spot on. That would be perfect. Very good.
I wonder, though, I'm intrigued by you talking about the sort of rhetorical device of the refrain. I'm interested to ask, because I tried it once in a sermon. I don't know, others will tell me how successful it was. But I wonder if you have any tips about how to do that effectively. How to, is there too much? Can you have said it too many times that people go, oh yeah, we get it, you're going to say that again? Or how do you find that?
Well, I think it's all about tone of voice for me. And I remember in my autumn lecture a couple of years ago, when I sort of laid out the Christological position I'd come to during my research fellowship 6 months previously. And the theme was "Here I Stand," as is the theme this year. And I used "Here I Stand" as a refrain in that lecture. I think it's the only time I remember doing it actually in a lecture as opposed to in a sermon. And I had 7 points to make, and I said "Here I stand" at the end of each one of them in a kind of quiet. I didn't say it "Here I stand" in a shouty way, because I never do that. But in a sort of "Here I stand" is a sort of like a full stop to each paragraph. And there was a sort of, what it was supposed to be was a quiet assertiveness rather than a declamatory or proclamatory announcement. So I think you can do it in a lot of different ways. You can also do it sort of call and response. You can actually get people to join in after a while. I remember doing an Easter sermon on about the stone rolling away from the tomb. I think it was something, the refrain was something like, it was the day of the rolling stone. And went through again 6 or 7 different motifs about what was rolling away, and finished each section with, it was the day of the rolling stone. I think you can build momentum like that without becoming either kind of childish or artificial.
Yeah, I guess that's it. Is it still being authentic to you?
It's got to be your character, and I think a lot of that is about the tone of voice, how you do it. And for me, it's all about, I think I've said to you before, I once went to Michigan for the second time to preach in a university setting, and the dean brought forward a student who said, they've got a student who wants to say something to you. And the student said, you're the only preacher I've ever heard who, when you get to the crucial part of the sermon, goes quieter rather than louder. And, that I hadn't realized I did that, but that's obviously a sort of an authentic rhetorical tick that I have. And I was really pleased to hear that, because I sort of thought, well, no, that sounds true to me. I'm glad I didn't realize I did that, but I'm glad you feel I do that, because that's the kind of way I'd like to talk.
Yeah, good. Well, we will continue just to some comments coming in. If you are having some issues with if it's freezing or buffering, we apologize. But do stick with us or come back and watch it later, and it will be available. But we're going to push on and continue whilst we see what's happening in the background. Let's have a look then at Amos.
Yeah, I don't think we need to look at Amos for too long, really, because it obviously matches the gospel reading as often, but more specifically because it doesn't say what we think it's going to say.
Okay.
So what it says is there's a lot of people who are very comfortable right now, and you're going to be blown away by being invaded and go into exile. What we think it says, but it doesn't actually say, is, and it's all because you've oppressed the poor. The poor don't actually get a mention in this section.
Right, yeah.
So in that sense, it's only half relevant, or even a quarter relevant to the gospel passage. But you can see why they've chosen it to match.
Sure.
But that's why it's unpromising. It's about complacency, not about wealth. And so, that's why I say it's one of those passages that we think we know what the Bible's going to tell us, and it turns out that's not actually what it's saying.
Which I guess in itself is interesting as a thing.
It's interesting, and there's always a sermon to be preached about complacency, but it tends to be almost inherently self-righteous, because you only point out complacency in other people.
Yeah.
And that indicates a kind of complacency, so it's kind of circular, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's continue on then, and let's give rich people a drubbing in this reading instead, and let's have a look at First Timothy.
Well, that is interesting, because this is a sort of continuous reading, but it turns out it also has sort of wealth and poverty issues, at least at the beginning. And the love of the money is a root of all kinds of evil. And one of the most misquoted verses of the Bible of them all.
Money is rather than
because it usually says money is the root of evil rather than the love of money. Well, good luck preaching on that. Obviously it's a much richer text that we got in the gospel, and you're almost certainly going to go for that if you don't go for Jeremiah. There are other themes which you might miss in the second half, or the last 3 quarters of this reading. But again, it's 1 Timothy is a challenge to preach on. It's a you shouldn't say things like this about parts of the Bible, but it's just a shallower book than Paul's undisputed letters. And all the things it tends to say are kind of fine, but not as interesting. So, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, gentleness. It's not as dynamic as the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. It's, but it's in the same trajectory.
Yeah.
So you're going to preach on Galatians 5 if you're going to take those kind of themes. So that is the issue with preaching on 1 Timothy, which is why I very, very seldom do it.
Yeah, no, I get that. I mean, that was the line I was going to pick up on. So yeah, I think you've covered that. I'm going to say if there was any line in there that I thought, oh, well, there's something in that, I would probably have asked about those. But like you say,
I think the only line I'd be drawn to in this, if I wasn't, immediately drawn to either of the Jeremiah or the Luke, both of which are gimmies really for preaching, is the very last line. They may take hold of the life that really is life. I think for an evangelistic address, the life that really is life is a great starting point. So, I think you could do some work with that, but I'm not sure about the rest.
And can I ask then, before we come on to the gospel, you mentioned this yesterday, and I think in the lecture with Bishop Rowan Williams, and I think you talked about how in the church, quite uniquely, really in society, we still have such a diversity of people under the same roof. Places where the rich and the poor are together, and many other different dividing factors, I suppose, or that can be dividing factors. With a reading like this, but particularly if you're not going to preach on it, and I know you talked about this a bit before, but you're hearing this kind of language around having wealth and this sort of thing. Like, is there? Do you ever need to sort of talk about that, particularly in a church setting where there is that big disparity? We certainly have that in our parish, of great wealth and great poverty materially.
I don't think we have huge amounts of great wealth. We certainly have significant poverty.
Yeah.
And I don't obviously look up all the income levels of all our congregation, but
sorry, that's just my hobby then.
It's just your role, but I don't think we have manifest wealth.
No, sure.
We don't know obviously everyone's personal circumstances, but obviously it's a significant range.
Yeah.
I actually think that's probably more an issue for the gospel than it is for the Timothy reading. But I will suggest as we go through the gospel one way to address that.
Okay, well, let's go into the gospel then. I mean, like you say, we're in similar territory in terms of talking. We have this rich man character, and we have this Lazarus. I for some reason, forgive me, Father, I wasn't familiar with this passage. It didn't. Like I was reading it for the first time. I'm sure I have seen it before, but I found some of the imagery quite powerful.
Maybe, I mean, Luke's gospel, it's really very well written and well worth the read.
Yeah, I should spend a bit more time with it.
Yeah, I do recommend it. Okay, so there's lots to say about this, and I'm going to go through pretty rapidly.
Right.
Because it's a video and people can go back and watch bits again if they want to. So, okay. So the rich man is recklessly wealthy, vast amounts of food, presumably enormous number of friends because of the banquets, and purple and fine, the very best clothes. So, off the scale wealthy. Lazarus is sick, experiencing disability, ritually unclean. In the first century, has some real deficits there. So on their death, there is no moral dimension. The poor man goes upstairs and the rich man goes downstairs. It's not delivered as judgment. It just is. Then, perhaps most fascinatingly of all, the rich man speaks to Abraham. He doesn't repent. He assumes Lazarus is his slave and can do his bidding. But he actually orders Abraham so Abraham is in some ways his slave as well. He interestingly knows Lazarus' name.
Yeah.
Then there's a second pleading like the Bourbons, when they came back to power in 1815 in France, they'd learnt nothing and forgotten nothing. Rich man has learnt nothing from his first encounter and conversation. He still thinks Lazarus is his slave. He's just got a different job for him to do. And he implies the scriptures are not enough.
Mm.
You know, not a good thing to say the Holy Spirit if the Holy Spirit is supposed to have written them. Just saying. So, you know, there's lots of theological significance in this passage. You can go on for a long time. Why does the church care for people in material poverty? Out of gratitude to God. The orphan, the widow, and the alien remind us of Egypt when we were likewise. The church cares for the poor, you know, those experiencing material poverty, not for their benefit, but for the church's benefit, because its eternal salvation depends on it. And cares for those with material poverty, not because they're deserving, but because they are poor. There's no moral dimension to this. Lazarus's ethics are not evaluated. Then there's, you know, reflection on Jesus's resurrection. It turns out, you know, in this passage, a story, albeit a story, but before Jesus's passion, Jesus is already kind of anticipating his resurrection, but he's already also anticipating his resurrection won't be enough to persuade people.
Yeah.
We are really the brothers in the story.
Okay.
You know, waiting to be warned, and this story is warning us. It's wonderfully paradoxical because Abraham doesn't let Lazarus warn them, but the story warns us anyway. Do you see what I mean? It's you know, it's brilliantly
Sort of
done.
meta. Yeah.
It's fascinating, and I guess the crucial kind of twist point in it is that there is a barrier. There's a, you know, if you sort of draw a barrier like this, there's a barrier between the ins and the outs, and in this life, Lazarus is the outs and the rich man is the ins, and then they swap over in the next life. But the important point is that the barrier is made by us and not by God. So, you know, there's interesting takeaways. Again, returning to the point that the rich man knows Lazarus's name. You know, this is a story about people we already know. This isn't a story about people in Namibia.
Okay.
Well, at least that's, you know, that's what this story is about. This is a story about not shielding ourselves from human distress. You know, that's one thing I think I can say about my last 13 years living at the address I live at, is that I can't shield myself from human distress because I'm, as you know very well, stepping over somebody who slept at my doorstep probably more than 50% of the mornings I leave the house. So I don't want to say I know every single person's name, but for me, this isn't an issue about the other side of the world. The other side of the world is literally on my doorstep. Having said all of that, and this comes back to the point I was making earlier, I said I was going to say earlier about how we deal with some of these issues as a congregation that experiences some inequality. You know, you could have said, I don't think you can say now quite as boldly, but you could have said probably 30 years ago that our Lazarus is Africa. I think Africa is a more complex place now than it once was. But, you know, if you think about the 1980s and Live Aid and so on, I think that could have been a thing that people might have felt comfortable saying. Comfortable in terms of accuracy, not comfortable in terms of how it feels. You know, and there are things that you can, you know, you can do when somebody isn't on their doorstep. I mean, even when they are on your doorstep, you're overwhelmed by how powerless you are. You know, you can march, you can sponsor, you can covenant, you can make links, all sorts of things. But in the end, this is about friendship. You make friendships today, or you will be enemies tomorrow.
Yeah. Remind me of is it Gustavo Gutierrez who said, so you say you love the poor, name them. As a kind of challenge.
Yeah, nice.
It's really stuck with me. You can't say we love the poor if you can't even name them.
Yes, exactly. And that's really what our international group at St. Martin's is about. It's not really about the lunch, and it's not really about the washing machines and the showers. It's really about the fact that 60 or 70 members of our congregation know by name probably 25 plus people who are destitute, and whose situations are complex and internationally not easy to disentangle from, and have respectful relationships in which they talk about important things like Manchester United, rather than how can I fix your housing crisis.
Exactly.
In other words, conversations that are about assets, not about deficits, and that position the respective parties as equals rather than as benefactor and the needy. So this is really about, if we can't be friends with one another, then how can we be friends with God? That's that's the bottom line.
I like that very much. I think. And will you be preaching on this one? Are you preaching this week?
I'm not.
No, not this
week.
week.
I just have. I think you'll find.
No,
I'm not. I'm preaching this coming weekend on the gospel for a change. I don't often preach on the gospel these days, but I am going to be doing so this weekend. And I would have been very happy.
Have you preached on this passage before? Is there somewhere people could look for something of what?
I don't know if I have, actually.
Yeah.
I can't think of a time at St. Martin's or at Duke and those tend to be the kind of the written down sermons, because I used to preach extemporary before that. I don't recall this, and I can't think of a book where I've, talked about this at any great length. Possibly there might be a passage in the Christology book, but I don't remember.
Well, I find it fascinating. So I'll wait 3 years, and I expect you to do it then, please. Okay.
So there's a lot to say. I mean, I do think that this is, you want to be preaching for one of these two readings, because they're gifts, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sam. We are just coming to the end of our time here for another week. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and your patience. If you had any trouble with the live stream, we will be back next Tuesday, as always, and we look forward to doing more reading with you. But until then, have a happy week.